Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Carrie Mulkowski. I am the Director of Education here at FAIR, and I am delighted to be your moderator for today's discussion. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few quick housekeeping things. Please note that for maintaining a quality recording, everyone joining us today is going to be muted throughout the presentation. However, that is not going to stop you from joining in on the discussion. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Zoom by now, but you should see in your Zoom toolbar a little Q&A button. You can use this to communicate directly with me. Let's say you're having any technical difficulties, feel free to shoot me a message and I'll do my best to help you out. But also, most importantly, you can use this feature to ask questions. We did build in a little time at the end of the presentation for a few moderated questions. Unfortunately, we won't get to everyone's, but we'll do our best to ask some of the top ones. So feel free to shoot them at any time. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Karina Venter. Dr. Venter is an Associate Professor of Pediatrics, Section of Allergy Immunology at the Children's Hospital Colorado and University of Colorado Denver School of Medicine, where she is conducting research in allergy prevention and working with children with a range of food allergies. As a senior advisor to FAIR, she serves as a subject matter expert across all programmatic areas and supports content, advocacy, and strategic partnerships. She is the past chair of the International Network for Diet and Nutrition and Allergy and a member of the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, and the European Academy of Allergy and Clinical Immunology, and lastly, the British Society for Allergy and Clinical Immunology. She is also a registered dietitian in the United Kingdom, United States, and South Africa. We are so excited to have her with us. And at this time, I am delighted to turn it over to Dr. Venter to get us started.
Thank you for that introduction. And I'm really very happy to be here today. And before we start, you just need to be aware of all my disclosures. And the one that I'm particularly proud of is really my advisory board member role in FAIR. So today we will discuss an overview of current guidelines. We will discuss the U-turns we've made in the allergy world. I will talk about things that I'm really interested in, and my research is focused on diet diversity and diet indices. And then I'll try and get really practical about the remaining questions about food introduction. I do know that my wonderful colleague, Marian Gruch, is also in the audience today, if I could say that. She's written many of these papers with me, and so I will be referring to a lot of the work we've done. So this very busy slide actually highlights all the changes we've seen in the allergy world over the last 2 decades. And I don't want you to get too confused about everything that's going on the slide, and I'm not even going to try and explain it to you. But worldwide, if we just focus on the colors, you can see that we went from avoiding allergens, and particularly peanut during pregnancy, breastfeeding, and early life, in the 1998 to 2000, and that was here in America and across the pond. And then we changed our guidance slightly by saying perhaps we shouldn't be avoiding allergens in pregnancy, breastfeeding, and definitely not in the first 3 years of life, but we weren't ready to say yet that we should be eating allergens. Then we had the data published from the LEAP and the EAT study, and the guidelines then changed into the greens. Australia, United Kingdom, and America, we came out with guidelines. I was fortunate to be involved in many of these guidelines, where we're now actively suggesting that babies should be introducing peanut and other allergens in the first year of life, and that mothers don't need to avoid peanut and other allergens during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And so really what I want to say from this slide is, it's okay if you were slightly confused in the last few years, because we were confused too. But I think we've really now moved into the green area, where we can say no avoidance required from pregnancy, breastfeeding, and early life. But in early life in particular, as soon as the baby is developmentally ready to eat, we want to start getting the allergens in with a focus or an emphasis on peanut and hard-boiled egg. And we will discuss practical issues in the last few slides. So one of the other U-turns that we've made, and people know that I'm very passionate about this, and I know as a mom, you wanted to have that normal delivery and then end up with an emergency C-section in the middle of the night. You wanted to breastfeed and thought it was going to go wonderful, and then it's actually quite hard work. Some mothers breastfeed with no problems, but it's also true that for some mothers it's a real struggle. And some of us, even though eventually we do make it to 12 months, don't particularly find that first few months easily. And then, the guidelines say, but you have to introduce the allergens while the baby is breastfeeding, and you don't know if you're actually going to manage that. And so the next 2 slides is really to say, breastfeed for as long as you can, but don't beat yourself up if it's not going the way you plan, because there's no direct evidence that there's an association between breastfeeding and food allergy prevention per se. There's some evidence for wheeze or asthma and eczema, but not for food allergy. And I just want to go back to this slide again. So if we do look at the data from Canada, you can see here that if mothers breastfed for any duration during the first year of life and introduce peanut at some point in the baby's life, in the first year of life, really, that there was a reduced sensitization to peanut, which is this column. So breastfeed if you can, introduce peanut in the first year of life, and then it should be associated with the reduced chance of your infant or your baby being sensitized to peanut. They didn't actually have data to show that it clinically made an effect, but good news in terms of sensitization. Then about 10 years ago now, I published data with Kate Grimshaw, and I'm afraid that the references are very small at the bottom there, but I can provide them if you can't see them. And so Kate Grimshaw, a friend of mine, showed that if you introduce cow's milk in the first year of life, it prevents all food allergies. I was living on the Isle of Wight, just about a mile across the water from Southampton, with similar data in mothers from the Isle of Wight. And we found that there was no association between concurrent breastfeeding and introducing cow's milk, or any allergen for that matter, in the prevention of food allergy. So if you can manage to breastfeed, but you can't breastfeed for long enough to cover the time while you're introducing the allergens, it's okay. There's no need to feel guilty. Just do your very best. And this advice has now been taken from the allergen guidelines. So if we then go to the definitions we use. So I've covered the fact that we've changed the guidelines. I've covered the fact that we should try and breastfeed for as long as we can, but don't beat ourselves up if it doesn't go as well as planned. But then we go perhaps to a more positive thing about what we really actively can do. And about, from 2014 onwards, I found when I went to food allergy conferences that everybody was talking about our new buzzword. So we had the window of opportunity between 4 and 6 months, which we now think any introduction in the first year of life is probably good enough, but try and do it closer to 4 and 6 months if you can. Then we had the buzzword about the concurrent breastfeeding and allergen introduction. And then we had the diversity buzzword. And so I wasn't really sure what that meant. And so I got the IACI position paper group together. I led that with Liam O'Mahony. And basically what we found, I'm sorry, my slides seem to progress by themselves, was that diversity in the first year of life really just meant that the children should have a diverse diet with a varied amount of foods, ideally healthy food. And so when we looked at the literature out there and we summarized it in this paper, at the time, there was only one study that focused on food allergy. And so I know this may be a little bit of a busy slide, but the line that I want you to focus on is the one study showing that if children had a more diverse diet in the first year of life, they were less likely to have food allergies up to 6 years. Following on from that, I then published my data from the Isle of Wight, where we defined diversity using 4 different measures. The one was the WHO definition of minimum diversity, which is really used in poorer countries to look at whether children is eating enough food and enough nutrients to be healthy. We looked at the number of foods that are introduced up to 9 months, so how varied was the child's diet. We looked at the number of food allergens introduced in the first 12 months. So by the time they got to 1, how many different allergens were they eating? And the final one was, we looked at how many fruit and vegetables the children were consuming. And it doesn't matter which definition of diversity we use, there was a very clear association between increased variety of food, whichever definition you've used, and reduced food allergy outcomes by 10 years of age. And so when we look at this, we can see here that for every additional food eaten by 6 months, so these babies were weaned early, and I'm going to show you how many foods they ate on the next slide. So with every additional food we give babies that's ready to eat before 6 months of age, we saw an 11% reduction in food allergies. But even more interesting was the data we saw by looking at food allergen intake. And with each additional food allergen we've given the babies by 12 months of age, we saw a 33% reduction in the odds of developing food allergy by 10 years of age. So really clearly the data is just showing us, let the babies eat. We give them more food, more varied food when they're ready to eat, rather than perhaps getting stuck on apple puree and mango for the first 2 months. Let's do some apple puree, mango puree, and mashed banana. And rather than just giving baby rice, let's do rice, quinoa, millet, and perhaps a corn cereal. And so the question I often then get asked is, so just how many foods did these babies eat, particularly the ones before 6 months of age, because that's very young age to eat. So the first thing I wanted to say, I was happy to see that by 3 months, at least none of the babies in our study were given any food. But by 6 months, and they had to pick foods between 0 and 21, so there were 21 options they could pick from. The median number of foods given was 11. It was small portions, and it really was varied fruit and vegetables, varied grains, and some of the children started to have yogurts. When we looked at food diversity, again, out of a total score of 21, by 9 months of age, the median diversity was about 16 foods, and it mainly ranged between 14 and 17. However, the other point I want to make is when we look at these, the lower range, there were some children who only had 5 different foods out of the 21 by 9 months of age. And again, this is perhaps a message to us as dietitians or a message to us as parents to say, don't get stuck on that applesauce and baby rice and yogurt. Give them different colored fruits, different colored vegetables, do progress in terms of textures, because the more varied, the less chances the child is to develop food allergies. And so that's sort of like the main thing. A majority of children by 6 months had between 9 and 13 foods, small portions, varied fruit and vegetables. And then by 9 months, it did increase to be between 14 and 17, but some of them were only having very few foods. So then this is sort of like the data that got hidden in my paper, because we all like the strap line and read the conclusion, but there's some other important or interesting data in this paper. And one of the reviewers of the papers actually said, there's an exhausting amount of information hidden in these tables. And so I'm not showing you all the tables and all the data today, but the things that I would like to highlight is, when we looked at which factors, family factors or demographic factors was associated with food allergy in the child, we didn't find that family history or maternal history of allergic diseases was associated. The one association we did find was that maternal history of food allergy increases the chances of the child developing food allergy. So again, moms, if you have a food allergy, please don't beat yourself up over that. But the other reassuring message I want to say is, just because you may have some allergies in the family, such as seasonal allergies, or dad may have asthma, doesn't necessarily mean that your child will eventually end up with food allergies. The hygiene hypothesis, as I'm sure you've all heard about, say that the more children you have, the less likely the subsequent children are to have food allergies. We didn't find it in our study. So the first child was more likely to have food allergy than child number 2 or 3. We didn't find any association between breastfeeding or breastfeeding duration and food allergy, as I've already highlighted. Time and time again, age of introduction of solid food associated with food allergy outcomes. So it's sort of like the opposite of what we thought at the time, and I kept asking the statisticians to go back and look at the data again. But what we found was that the babies with weaned earlier had less food allergy. So today it's the norm. 10 years ago, everybody said to me, are you sure your data is right? But now we know that earlier introduction of solids when they're ready is associated with less food allergy. And no surprise, my data was used to some extent to power some of the well-known randomized trials we now have in allergy prevention. But we saw here clearly that there's an association between having eczema in the first year of life and then developing food allergy over the first 10 years of life. So we've got to try and prevent eczema. We've got to try and treat eczema. And I get back to that to prevent allergies. Other factors of interest was, did eczema or having eczema lead to delayed introduction of solid foods? No. Often people say that perhaps eczema is associated with food allergies because the kids eat later. That wasn't the case in our study. Did eczema lead to fewer allergens introduced by 1 year of age? No, we didn't find that having eczema reduced the number of food allergens introduced. I'm going to get back to filaggrin loss of function in the next 2 slides, but for now, just hang on there. Is the filaggrin loss of function mutation associated with increased food allergy? Yes. So these children that had this loss of function mutation, which I'll explain on the next slide, did have food allergies. And was the filaggrin loss of function mutation associated with eczema? Surprisingly, no, because that mutation drives eczema, but it was because we were underpowered. And if we had a larger cohort, we probably would have seen that association. So if we then go to the next slide, and you can read the information on the side, basically, our genes code for which protein we make. So if we have a problem with one of our genes, like we have a mutation in one of our genes, such in the filaggrin gene, we make less proteins. And in this case, the proteins that we make because of the filaggrin function in normal circumstances will make sure that we have a healthy, proper, intact skin barrier. When we have the filaggrin loss of function mutation, and we have issues with that, we make less proteins, which means we sort of like have a leaky gut barrier. And that means that environmental allergens and also food allergens can enter the skin. The skin doesn't actually have a very friendly immune system. It doesn't like the allergens come in, and it's almost like my small puppy who's always on alert and say, what's happening? It's almost as if the skin goes into that mode when the barrier is disturbed. And when the food allergens enter, it's almost like a jerk reaction, knee-jerk reaction saying, what's happening here? And then it launches an allergic response. Whereas if we can get the allergen into the gut first, where the gut have a more friendly and more tolerogenic immune system, that's when we get tolerance. And this is sort of like almost why we're running a race against eczema to try and prevent food allergies, and why Dr. Lack often says, particularly in the children with eczema, we really want to get the allergens, particularly peanut and egg, in as soon as they can eat, because we want to get it into the gut before it can penetrate via the skin. And so I am blessed with amazing colleagues across the world working in the field of allergy. And so this is one of my very dear colleagues, Professor Pete Smith. We've just had a paper accepted together this week, and a beautiful diagram he sent me that really explains the issue with atopic dermatitis or eczema and food allergy. And so first with eczema, we want to get the genes right. So we don't have issues, don't want to have issues with filaggrin, which we can't fix at this point in time, but something to keep an eye on. We can actually fix the issue with food, where when a child has eczema, we get the allergens in early. We're doing some studies now, and Professor Donald Leung is doing some great work looking at the microbiome of the skin and see if we can modify that And we know that children with atopic dermatitis have different microbiome on their skin than kids without atopic dermatitis. Can we do something about the skin microbiome that's going to help us to cure eczema and also prevent food allergies? We want to keep the irritants out. We don't want to wash babies with Dove soap 3 times a day. And I apologize for using a brand name, but we don't want to use soaps to wash babies with 3 times a day. We want to maintain the gut barrier function. So, you know, we want to put ointments and emollients on there. We want to make sure babies have enough vitamin D. In terms of vitamin D, remember, too much of a good thing is never a good thing. We want enough vitamin D, but over-supplementation with vitamin D in pregnancy and in the first year of life are both associated with increased food allergy. So don't overdo it. Just get babies what they need. We want to reduce infection in the gut. There's been some studies, again by Dr. Leung, indicating that children with Staph aureus infection in the gut are more prone to develop food allergies. And then we want to find ways to just make the immune response in the skin a little bit more tolerogenic than what we see in children with atopic dermatitis. And so I hope that really explains to you this association we have with atopic dermatitis, why we always seem to think the babies with eczema are those at high risk of developing food allergies, and all the different factors that can help to enhance our skin barrier function. But then when we were writing this IACI position statement, one of the immunologists, there were many immunologists on this position statement, Dr. Chesme Actis from Switzerland said to me, Karina, it doesn't make sense that dye diversity could prevent food allergy in particular, because there's no direct way that dye diversity can interact with the T cells. Because we know peanut interact with T cells and egg protein interact with T cells, but just dye diversity per se cannot interact with the T cells. And so we looked further into possible mechanisms on why dye diversity may be protective. And despite the fact that we don't have any direct studies I can quote, we think that dye diversity may prevent food allergy because of its effect on the microbiome. If you've listened to some of my previous talks through FAIR, you know that I often state that increased dye diversity is associated with reduced food allergy, apart from egg allergy, which seems to be an outlier. But for the most of it, we think that increased dye diversity and increased microbial diversity is associated with less allergy. And here you can beautifully see that association. As the child's diet diversity or food variety increase in the first year of life by eating family foods and hopefully healthy family foods, so does the microbial diversity increase, which will hopefully prevent food allergy. Getting back to the healthy aspects of diet diversity, you can see increase in microbial diversity as we're feeding the baby more fiber, as we're feeding the baby more protein foods, and allergens are all protein foods. But unfortunately, we see the opposite effect when we feed babies too much fat. And so when I get to the practical slides, I will reiterate again that we want to get the allergens in. We particularly want to get the nuts in. We don't want to overfeed on nuts because they're high fat foods. So we want them for their protein content. They all contain fiber. We want them for their fiber content, but we don't want to overfeed and just feed nuts all the time because of their very high fat content. Then Caroline Rudet, I previously referred to her work on diet diversity, took it all a step further, and she looked at infants that had high yogurt, so fermented food, fish, and fruit and vegetable intake, so quite a nice, healthy, diverse diet in the first year of life. And she found that they had a more diverse microbiome, so they were producing more butyrate. Butyrate upregulated T regulatory cells, so the cells that's saying to the immune system, everything's going to be fine, let's just stay calm. I don't know, I'm one of 4 sisters, and we have one sister who's a teacher. She's the one who always says, everything's going to be fine, stay calm. So she sort of like in our family acts as the T regulatory cell. And then clinically, we saw that the children had less food allergy. And so then the dietitian in me sort of like thought, So why do we have to eat a healthy, diverse diet just so we can get a diverse gut microbiome, when the thing we really want is the butyrate? Because it seems like butyrate is the short chain fatty acid in the gut that's going to positively affect the T-regulatory cells and subsequent less allergic outcomes. And then I started to read about butyrate, and I also have to admit, I just emailed my colleague, Professor Pete Smith, because he knows all about these kind of things. And he said ghee is the answer, because ghee is one of the only foods that contain butyrate. But now we have a double whammy, because we have fat intake, very high fat in ghee, which is not good for microbial diversity. But then we have the butyrate in the ghee that could possibly reduce food allergy outcomes. However, please, we are not at the point where we're going to feed babies ghee at mass. It's not a healthy food. We have no idea whether the butyrate in the ghee actually will get to the colon intact, or whether it will be broken down by the time it gets there. But I think it is an interesting concept, and something that, you know, we may hear more about in subsequent studies and over the next few years. So we talked about the importance of diet diversity, but there's one big problem with increasing diet diversity, particularly in the United States. And it's because the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Center for Disease Control are still recommending that we wait about 3 days between new foods. And if we wait 3 days between apples and pears, and another 3 days to do banana, and another 3 days to do oranges or baby rice, we're never going to get the allergens in, and we're never going to get the diet diverse. And so it was interesting, the study published by Dr. Gupta, who's also one of the chief advisors or one of the medical advisors of FAIR, where she showed that currently pediatricians are still recommending families to wait a number of days between introducing new foods, because of this guidelines from the American Academy of Pediatrics and the CDC. And so the conclusion from her paper was that this advice may need to be reviewed. So in my clinical practice, in the absence of any guidance that's telling me to say that, I do advise families to perhaps do fruit and vegetables one day after the other, similar with grains, but wait probably 2 to 3 days, or perhaps just 2 days between the allergens. But we definitely do not have to wait 3 days between every new food. And amongst all of this, you know, when it comes to how many days do we wait between new foods, and when do we give the peanut, and when do we give the egg, it's important that we make sure that we get our public health messages right. And this is data from my PhD, now published in 2007, where the previous advice in the United Kingdom was, as I already said, that if mothers come from a family where there's any allergic disorder, they may want to avoid eating peanuts during pregnancy and breastfeeding. But when we actually looked at the time at which mothers are avoiding peanuts during pregnancy, it was first-time mothers, and it had nothing to do with whether they had a family history of allergy. And that was one of the reasons the COT advice was then withdrawn. So it is important that when we do come out with new guidance and that we do give advice, we make sure that healthcare professionals understand the advice, and that it's also conveyed to the families appropriately and correctly. Then when we look at the US now about the guidance, so do pediatricians understand the guidelines, and what are they advising families to do? It's really good to see that over 90% of pediatricians are aware of the new guidelines. It is, however, disappointingly to see that about only 30% of them advise families to follow the guidance. But when we look at the reasons why they are not advising families to follow the guidelines, it makes perfect sense that they're a little bit hesitant. Families don't really want to start introducing allergens because they're concerned about allergic reactions. They don't really understand the guidelines. The American Academy of Allergy, Asthma and Immunology guidelines, and also the college guidelines was accepted 2 days ago. So any day now we should be seeing these guidelines on the internet, and you know, we're very pleased about the fact that the guidelines have now been accepted. It's been about 2 years of work. And so hopefully that will make this whole process a bit earlier. But the current NIAID guidelines, of which I was a member of as well, great guidelines, but can be tricky to interpret if you're a general pediatrician, because it is slightly complex with different levels of risk. So they don't really understand the guidelines. One of the confusing things about the guidelines is that some people may perhaps think that we advise that in-office supervised feeding should be done for all infants. That's not the case, and that will hopefully now be cleared up with the guidelines that was approved 2 days ago. So I can understand that actually put doctors off advising families to introduce allergens, because they haven't got the capacity to get these families to come in and introduce every allergen under supervised feeding recommendations. And then about 65%, 2/3 of pediatricians say they needed further training. So the pediatricians are saying, hey, we're on board. We understand these guidelines. We would like to interpret them. We're slightly confused. Parents are slightly hesitant, but train us and give us written information, and we will follow the guidelines. And this is one of the reasons why myself, Marion Crouch, Dr. Brian Schroer, and Dr. Doug Mack wrote a very practical paper about introducing our food allergens, and I will be quoting our paper on the next few slides. Again, this was a paper we started in February this year. We thought we're going to write a short communication. It's going to take us about 2 weeks and the paper will be out. And the paper was finally accepted, as you can see, the end of October. So it took us a good 9 months to put the paper together and get it thoroughly reviewed. But we're very pleased, and we hope that the guidance would be of practical use for pediatricians, families, and other healthcare professionals. But one of the sticky situations we got in as we were writing this paper was that the draft US Department, USDA guidelines came out. It's definitely draft guidelines. It's written by the committee. We're waiting for it to be approved and become official guidelines. But you can look at how I try to summarize this, but I'm going to verbally summarize this for you as well. And really, early introduction of allergens, trying to get 6 grams of every allergen in a week, or 2 grams 3 times a week if we want to do all allergens, and trying to fit within these draft guidelines, it's not working. It's not happening. And so you can see here, if you do it between 4 to 6 months and you do 2 allergens, you could probably get 1 to 2 grams of an allergen in. But if you get to about 7 months and you're trying to give 7 allergens, you will struggle again to get more than 1 to 2 grams of every allergen in. And so if we just look here at 9 to 12 months, which is similar to 7 to 8 months, we can get 2 grams of protein of an allergen in per week for 7 allergens, or 2 grams per week for 2 allergens, and then 1 gram for 5 allergens. So we can now talk about the grams of protein, and we can make it very complex, and we can get even more anxious about getting the dosages right. Bottom line is, if you're going to try and introduce all allergens into your infant's diet, it would make sense to stick to the amounts we recommend in the tables. If you're just going to focus on egg and peanut, you could probably get away with adhering to the guidelines completely. So let's the baby eat. So introducing the peanut allergens. So peanut. We can use 1 to 2 teaspoons of peanut butter or powder about 2 to 3 times a week. But like I say, if you want to get the other allergens as well, you may want to just give it once or twice a week. So emphasis on peanut. We can easily get it 2 to 3 times a week in. Peanut alongside allergens, we may have to reduce it to 1 to twice a week. We can use peanut flour. We can use thin peanut butter. Dietitians always remind me after my talks to say that peanut, of course, is a choking risk. We don't want to give whole peanuts until the child is older. And even if we give peanut butter, we don't want to give lumps of peanut butter. We want to liquidize it or puree it down with some water and then mix with some fruit and vegetable purees. And this is a very nice handout we've produced that goes along with the NIAID guidelines. In terms of egg should be well cooked. We're still debating whether well cooked means well baked or well boiled. I'd say for the beginning, it's probably good to go for well-boiled egg. It's about 10 minutes of boiling, so it's really a hard-boiled egg. But if you add some water, breast milk, or infant formula to that and put it through a blender or a liquidizer, it does make a really nice smooth paste, which you can then mix in with yogurt, or you can mix it in with fruit or vegetable purees. About a third of a well-cooked egg, if it's a large egg, twice a week. Again, the European guidelines used small eggs in their guidelines, so they're going to say about half of an egg. But somewhere between half and a third of an egg twice a week is perfectly okay. If the baby boy gets to about 10 months of age, he loves his food and he wants to eat the whole egg, please let him go ahead and eat the whole egg. There's no reason to stop after just a third. There's no guidelines. So the peanut and the egg guidelines I've just discussed really come from the peanut prevention trials and the egg prevention trials. But when we get to the other allergens such as wheat, sesame, and cow's milk, we have very limited data from prevention guidelines. And for some foods, we have no data at all. And so we put these amounts together from the Dietary Guideline Committee, just in terms of general healthy eating. I think wheat is the easiest. Most kids would eat wheat-containing foods at least once or twice a day, and it's about half an ounce to 1 ounce. Seeds and tree nut intake was not separated by the dietary guidelines. So the dietary guidelines recommend about half an ounce of seed or more a week. So we calculated it to be about 3 teaspoons of seed or nut butter. I'm going to show you a recipe about a few slides further down. It probably makes sense to just make a nut butter, or you can buy a commercial nut butter or a commercial nut mix and add some tahini paste into that. Keep it in the fridge and give about 3 teaspoons spread over the course of the week. Main thing is, once you've introduced the allergen, keep it in. Keep it in as regular as possible. And then for cow's milk, I think it worked out really well. I just really looked yesterday at how much cow's milk is in the baby yogurts or small pots of yogurt, and it's about 2.5 to 4 ounces. So it's really just a small pot of yogurt a day. And sometimes you can alternate that by giving cheese, perhaps an ounce of cheese, particularly in older infants where we're not that concerned about the sodium content of cheese, but we definitely don't want to give cheese in a 4.5-month-old baby, where we could start with the baby yogurts. Ideally plain ones where we add our fruit in, because many of the yogurts do contain quite a lot of sugar. So again, just summarizing this slide, we want to give grains once or twice a day. We want to give seeds and or tree nuts 3 teaspoons a week. They don't actually say it's got to be 1 teaspoon of seeds and 2 teaspoons of tree nuts. So a mixture is fine, or perhaps one week you'll be giving more seeds, the other week you'll be giving more tree nuts. And then it's about a small pot of yogurt a day, which you can alternate with cheese in older infants. Then in terms of seafood, internationally guidance on seafood, fish and seafood intake, other seafood intake differ. So it's important that we adhere to our own national guidance, and seafood and fish intake recommendations is about 1 ounce per serving 3 times a week. So it's about 3 ounces a week. And we don't want to use the bigger fin fish, such as swordfish, for example, because they have they have high mercury content. So we really want to stick to the lower mercury fin fish, but you can read more about that on the USA Food and Drug Administration website. Getting back to the tree nuts, again, they go hand in hand with the seeds, and we have already discussed that. And then if you really actively want to get soy into the child's diet, we could just use a small pot of soy yogurt if we want. We have now been looking extensively in America, and we seem to find only 1 soy yogurt plain without sugar. The majority of even the plain soy yogurt have a bit of sugar in, and I think it is just to make it palatable for the infants. So you can have yogurt. Otherwise, it would make sense to have 2 vegetarian dinners a week, and you can replace the meat in the meal with 2 tablespoons of soft tofu, which would be 4 tablespoons a week. So I talked about our nut butter recipe. You can see here is the recipe and how to make it. You can always just stick 1 or 2 tablespoons of tahini paste in with that, mix it all together, keep it in the fridge, and then give it to the infant on 2 to 3 occasions a week. If you're really concerned about the exact gram of every tree nut that you want to give the child a week, I would say to just discuss this table with a dietitian. Even general pediatric dietitians should be able to help you to calculate exact amounts of how much to eat. But like I said, it would be very difficult to get 2 grams of every tree nut, 2 grams of protein of every tree nut in 3 times a week while adhering to the dietary guidelines, because in short, actually, it wouldn't be possible, which is why we say let's just have the nut butters 2 to 3 times a week, because we also want to make sure that the infants have a healthy diet alongside the fact that we're trying to introduce these allergens. So I do hope I've clarified that for you. Problems with adherence in the EAT study, these are the parents' problems with adherence. They said the infants had swallowing issues, they didn't like the food. They said the kids got digestive issues, so they might have had diarrhea. Some kids might have become constipated, and then other practical problems, like it was a bit inconvenient to try and food these allergens so frequently all the time. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a bit of water. So again, this is where dietitians come in, and we have many parent advocates. We have many parents who's writing really useful blogs about early introduction. And so perhaps when we talk to other parents, either as healthcare professionals or as parents of food allergic children ourselves, we really need to try and get a practical message across of get the allergens in, keep it in, but perhaps those exact dosaging may not be that important, because it leads to people just giving up because it gets too complex and too difficult. This is just, again, from our paper. You can have a look, the calories and the cost of just giving normal food while we're trying to introduce the allergens. So we have the hard-boiled egg, we have different versions of peanut. And as you can see, it's really not too expensive to just give a baby egg and just give a baby peanut butter, which we liquidize or dilute and then mix in with fruit and vegetable puree. Even the healthier versions are not really that costly. There are now also very many commercial options available. We do discuss all these options with their pricing in the paper. But again, I think a few months ago, we were all very clear that these commercial options should not be used. We should always use homemade food. But parents always teach me so much. And having done so many discussions about early introduction of allergens, it's really become clear to me that many families and many parents need to have more convenient options available. And so you can look at all the different options in the paper, but when we make the decision about homemade food versus commercial food, or perhaps using commercial food some days or some weeks and then homemade food some weeks, we really need to look at cost. They tend to be more expensive. We need to look at convenience. They're of course more convenient. We need to look at what additional ingredients there are. They tend to have the pure protein, which makes perfect sense, but we have to remember that a peanut contains good fats, it contains fiber too, egg contains iron, it contains biotin, which is an important nutrient as well. So when we buy the commercially available allergen products, we just need to be aware that there's nutrients that will then have to come from other foods, because they won't be included within this allergenic product. We need to look at nutrient composition, as I've said. We need to look at dose. Some of the products may have low dose allergen, some have higher dose allergen, and just make sure that whatever product you use does make sense in terms of dose. And frequency of intake, highly important too. So they may have a smaller dose, but if you give it more often than just twice a week, your dose will increase. And then also look at degree of heating. We do really want to recommend that ideally, at least the first month of introduction of egg should be well cooked, well heated, or well boiled egg, to make sure that children don't have severe allergic reactions, as we've seen in many of the trials where we've given the babies pasteurized raw egg, which has been heat treated to some extent, but the allergenicity is more similar to raw egg. And so really, in summary, I know this was a mouthful, but I did want to leave at least 10 minutes for discussion. The guidelines keep changing, but we're all on the same page when it comes to babies. Let them eat, give them a diverse, varied diet. Don't be scared of the allergens. Please don't get your calendar out and worry about every single gram of allergenic protein. For peanuts, it's about a teaspoon 1 to 3 times a week. Egg, about half to a third of an egg twice a week. Normally speaking, we get wheat into the children's diet at least every day. We could probably get away with the nut and seed butters by mixing them and then give 3 teaspoons over the course of a week. We can get soy in as a soy yogurt or tofu, and we can get milk in very easily as a small pot of baby yogurt, alternating with cheese. There are practical dilemmas. This is why we're giving these talks. This is why we're happy to help. Do get a referral to a dietitian if you're really struggling. But like I said, there's many parent advisors out there who is equally good at advising about all these complexities of early introduction of allergens. And then diet diversity, the association with food allergy looks promising, although we need probably more studies than just 2. And so at that, I would like to thank you, and I will open it for questions and answers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Venter. And I'm just so grateful for all of the research that you're involved in and your colleagues, and you're really moving this forward. So, and a huge thank you to our attendees who joined us and are very engaged and active and have asked some very thoughtful questions. So I'm going to jump right in. And so a few different questions that came in, I'll group them all around maybe people in your household that already have food allergies. And this is kind of a 2-part. And some people were asking about, let's say a mom or a dad, has a severe peanut allergy, and maybe it has already had anaphylaxis. Would this change, how or when they should introduce some of these allergens into a baby's diet? Does it change the recommendations for early intro? Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, so there's the guidelines, and then there's what makes clinical common sense. I sit on all these guidelines, but I'm probably more of a clinical common sense kind of person. The guidelines do not say that if the parents have peanut allergy or have had anaphylaxis, and that includes a sibling too, that we should bring them in and test. That's not one of the criteria. Although working with families, I personally have not come across any family where anybody in the family has got a severe peanut allergy, although all peanut allergies are severe, who were happy to just introduce it blindly into the infant at home. They want to come in for a consultation. They want to be tested. There's 2 things about testing. I'm fortunate that I work in a center where we can test them and offer them a peanut introduction on the same day, or at least within a week. The biggest problem would be is if you test and now the test is positive and you say to the family, well, I can't do the challenge for another 2 years, so don't give any peanut to the baby for 2 years. So if you go for testing because you're concerned, make sure that you go to an allergy service where the introduction or the challenge can be done timely. So that's the other thing. So we then introduce it in hospital. Then the other practical problem is this has now been a nut-free house forever. And now they have to feed peanuts twice a day or twice a week, not twice a day. And how are they going to do that? Again, I learned so much from families, and families make up their own minds. I have families where the twice a week peanut is given at the grandparents' house. I have families where the child carer or the nursery where the child's going, somebody is actually willing to stay behind, feed the baby the nuts, then clean, the facility, and the baby goes home. I'm not saying that's particularly the best option, but that's an option. Or I have families where perhaps mom or dad are not allergic. They then feed the baby the peanuts when the family member with nut allergy is not around. It's important that families should trust their ability to clean. So good cleaning with a commercial kitchen cleaner, good scrubbing, and using a dishwasher definitely can get rid of the peanut allergen. So fine if you want to introduce it in your own home, good cleaning. is just highly recommended, and not just wipe. You know, we want clean and scrub, and we want to use a commercial kitchen cleaner opposed to just normal dishwashing soap. And ideally, a dishwasher, you know, is also better to get rid of allergens than just hand washing.
Thank you. That's a great answer and great advice. We had a couple questions surprisingly come in actually before the webinar and during the webinar that talked about sensitive babies. So let's say a mom wrote in and she was saying with a 4-month-old who's completely breastfeeding, you know, and the baby has already experienced some reactions and minor and some rashes when the mom, let's say, eats peanuts or eat legumes. But then when the mom doesn't eat them and eliminates them, there's no reaction. So should this baby be introduced? Kind of just like if you are noticing that the baby's a little sensitive, should you keep moving forward?
Okay, so again, you know, there's many answers to this question. There's many allergists, and there's also papers published, so it's not just allergists, you know, saying this. We have data to show that even if mothers eat peanut, not all mothers will secrete any of the peanut protein via their breast milk, and that some mothers who eat peanut and do secrete the peanut via breast milk, it will be in such low amounts that it's unlikely to trigger a reaction. So first to say, it's probably fine eating peanut while you're breastfeeding. However, we always see these very sensitive children or children that has the ability to react to very small amounts, which the vast majority of children won't react to. The advice is that we really want to continue intake of allergen as far as possible, but we also don't want to expose a baby to an allergen that they're clinically reacting to. So the short and long of it is go see an allergist. The allergist then at that point will take a good clinical history, decide if they're going to test. Again, if you're the mom and they test, do not let them tell you now, don't go and give it for 3 to 6 months. Do ask for the challenge or the introduction, unless you know the skin prick test size or the specific IgE level is of such that the doctor regard it as a clinical allergy, in which case you have to avoid it. But I cannot reiterate enough, you know, babies often get rashes and they get, you know, unsettled during breastfeeding anyway, irrespective of the allergens you eat. And I'm not saying it's definitely not the peanut, but there's so many other things we need to think about, like, is the baby just hot? You know, is the baby just getting fussy because of other reasons? So, but if there's a concern, the worst thing you can do is stop eating it because you are concerned. The right thing to do is to continue eating it and get to an allergist so that we know whether we're dealing with a clinical allergy or not. I hope that
Wonderful.
makes sense.
It does. Thank you so much. So this question I know you'll like. So a few people kind of asked about microbiome and gut health, and they were asking about just any advice you have or different ways to improve a baby's gut health. Yeah.
You know, there's nothing more I want to be able to say that I have found the best probiotic supplement in the world. And if you give one of those a day, your baby's fine. But we're just not at that point. You know, we have some idea of some gut bacteria, particularly some species that may help to be protective against allergy or may even help to outgrow the baby allergy. But these bacteria, their main characteristic is that they are butyrate producers. And so it gets us back to butyrate. And so I think, you know, we don't have to be fixated now about any particular bacteria. What we want to have is a diverse gut microbiome that can help us to make the butyrate. And so really the only thing that we know that can help with gut diversity is food diversity. So let the child have a varied diet, have varied fibers in the child's diet. That's something I'm studying at the moment. So perhaps I'm a little bit ahead of my data, but you know, we don't just want fruit and vegetable fiber or just grain fiber. We want fibers to come from many different, the nuts, the fruits, the vegetables, the whole grains. And then babies need fat. They've got small tummies. It's difficult to get their calories in within that small tummy. So we're never going to give a baby a low-fat diet. We want to give the nuts and the nut butters and full-fat milk, but don't overdo it with fat intake, because again, that can reduce diversity. So it's really just keep it varied, keep it healthy. Yeah, is what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think I'll try to squeeze in two questions. I thought this one was kind of interesting. One of our attendees said that she has been told to feed her baby foods in their natural seasons only. Is there any comment that you have or an explanation for maybe the rationale that she was given? She thinks, was it proven to decrease pollen exposure and maybe help mitigate food allergy reactions? Is there any research around that? If you could just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think there's good enough evidence for just eating in season. I will get to the reasons why it may be beneficial. I have never seen a paper looking at seasonal eating and pollen exposure. Of course, we know that perhaps in adults, particularly with pollen food syndrome or oral allergy syndrome, that may play a role. But just in terms of prevention, I've never seen that. There's some limited evidence that eating in season will increase the nutrient composition, particularly the water-soluble nutrients in fruit and vegetables. And so perhaps we can say that if we have a more nutritious diet, we are nurturing our immune system better and therefore less likely to get allergies. But again, data indicating that children who eat only in season have a better gut microbiome or have less allergies, I've never seen. If there's anybody in the audience that's seen that, please add that to the chat box. But, you know, the whole process of prevention is so complex. It's the delivery, it's the breastfeeding, it's getting a varied diet in, it's getting the allergens in. I'd hate to put another level of complexity on the process if we don't have the evidence to support that.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'll just end with this last question because it came in a couple times. Someone was asking if when you're getting ready or when you're introducing tree nuts, would you recommend introducing them separately, one at a time, or can you introduce a few at a time together?
Yes, thank you for saying that because I omitted saying that in my talk. I do think it makes sense to give them single, you know, so you can do a few cashews. You know, I like to do cashew and pistachio go together. Some people may say if you've eaten cashew, that counts for pistachio too. But we tend to do cashew and then do pistachio, perhaps even just the next day or 2 days after. We do the same with pecan and walnut. And then, you know, do the others separate. And then once you've done them separate, that's then when I say, okay, now we can all mix them together and we're happy. There's no rule to say you can't just give them together first time off. But if they then react, you know, we don't know which one it is. In the families where the families did want an assessment, despite the guidance saying if they're low risk, they don't need an assessment. Some families really want it. So we may assess the kid. There's really no signs of eczema. There's no history of allergies in the family. None of the tests we did were positive. In those babies with the blessing of the allergist, we may just give all the tree nuts as a nut butter, one off. But that's because we're really convinced we're dealing here with a very low risk infant. If there's the slightest bit of eczema, slightest bit of history that concerns us, we will definitely do them one at a time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for clarifying that. I think we are at time, so I will pass it to you for a final thought, but just want to say on behalf of FAIR and all of the attendees, thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and making everything just so digestible and easy to understand. And thank you for the research that you're doing now and continue to do. We're so grateful. So thank you, Dr. Venter.
Thank you for having me. I think, you know, when my paper came out, somebody tweeted, actually it was Dr. Doug Mack from Canada. He said, see, let the babies eat. And I think that's probably the message I would like to leave people with is let's just let the babies eat. You know, people like myself and Marian Gruch, we spend hours a day calculating the protein content of every single allergenic food. I wouldn't like mothers to be like that. That's our job. But your job is to get your baby to love food and enjoy food, and for you to just enjoy the weaning process without getting too fixated on exact dosages and grams.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.